The HOA came for my beautiful, tranquil waterfall, hammering it down without warning. But when the judge ruled in my favor, no one saw it coming. What happened next changed everything. Jenna Taylor had poured years of effort into creating her perfect backyard sanctuary. It was more than just a garden. It was her personal escape, a place to unwind after the chaos of her demanding life. Every inch was meticulously designed, a decorative waterfall with crystal-clear water gently cascading over rocks, surrounded by vibrant, blooming flowers that added a burst of color and life. It was her pride, the one thing that had made her feel grounded in a world that often seemed overwhelming. But that tranquility, the very essence of her retreat, was shattered in a moment. Jenna returned home one afternoon to find the sound of a roaring engine and the grinding noise of a jackhammer. Her heart sank as she walked toward the backyard. It was then that she saw them, construction workers, armed with heavy equipment, tearing apart her waterfall. The soothing water she had spent years perfecting was now reduced to rubble. Shock paralyzed her, her breath caught in her throat. What was happening? She rushed toward them, demanding answers. One worker, noticing her, paused and explained that it was the Homeowners Association, HOA, that had ordered the destruction. The reason? The waterfall, in their view, violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. Jenna stood frozen, her mind racing in disbelief. She had received no warning, no notice. The HOA had decided to act without her knowledge, without even offering her the courtesy of a conversation. Her eyes scanned the wreckage of her beloved waterfall. How could this be? Her garden wasn't an eyesore. It wasn't a disruption to the neighborhood. If anything, it had been an oasis in a world of identical, sterile lawns. It had brought beauty, peace, and life to the block, and yet here it was, being ripped apart without a second thought. The anger inside her bubbled to the surface. How dare they? For a long moment, Jenna simply stood there, the sound of the workers' machines deafening in her ears as the fragments of her sanctuary were hauled away, piece by piece. But beneath that anger, something else began to stir. Determination. She wasn't going to let them destroy what she had built without a fight. Frustration quickly morphed into a burning fury inside Jenna. It wasn't just about the waterfall anymore. It was about the principle, about standing up for what was right. She had been wronged, and she wasn't going to let it slide. With determination in her eyes, she started gathering evidence, photographing the damage, documenting the destruction piece by piece. Jenna reached out to her neighbors, many of whom had admired her garden and its calming beauty, hoping they would stand by her. It wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for justice. Her sanctuary had been torn down, and she wouldn't let the HOA get away with it. But as hard as she pushed, the HOA remained cold and unyielding. They dismissed her pleas without a second thought, standing firm in their decision. Their response was always the same. The matter was final. The more Jenna dug into their policies, the more she uncovered their hypocrisy. Rules were selectively enforced, and residents who didn't conform to the HOA's rigid standards were punished, often for minor infractions, while others seemed to get away with far worse. It was clear, the HOA wasn't about fairness. It was about control. With every failed appeal, Jenna felt a wave of injustice wash over her, gnawing at her insides. She wasn't just battling faceless bureaucrats anymore. She was facing a system built on power and arrogance. Eric Murphy, the HOA president, had always treated her with thinly veiled contempt. His dismissive, condescending smile as he waved off her concerns was a constant reminder of the gap between them. A powerless homeowner and an entrenched leader of an organization that reveled in its control over the community. Jenna could see it now. This was bigger than a simple garden. This was about a fight for dignity, for respect, and for the right to live in her own space without being dictated to. It wasn't just about a waterfall being destroyed. It was about the fight against a system that saw people like her as insignificant, as easy targets. And Jenna was ready for war. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and Jenna stepped into the courtroom with a mixture of nervousness and resolve. Standing before Judge Montgomery, she noticed his apparent disinterest. He barely glanced at her as she presented the case, and his body language gave no hint of which way he was leaning. Still, Jenna was determined. She laid out the evidence meticulously, her photographs, the testimonies from her neighbors, and the glaring inconsistencies in the HOA's decision-making process. It was clear that they had acted arbitrarily, enforcing rules selectively without giving her a fair chance to respond. On the other side, Eric Murphy and his legal team were smooth, well-prepared, and confident. They skillfully twisted the language of the community guidelines, arguing that Jenna's waterfall violated the spirit of the HOA, a nebulous concept that seemed to change depending on their whims. Their arguments were vague but convincing, and Jenna couldn't help but feel the weight of their words. They claimed that she had overstepped her boundaries, that her tranquil retreat, which she had poured her heart and soul into, didn't belong in the community. As the hearing progressed, the tension in the room grew thick. Jenna's heart sank with every word she heard from the opposing side. It felt as though the system was rigged, stacked against her from the beginning. She could almost hear the final gavel in her mind, knowing deep down that no one would stand up for her. The judge seemed unmoved, indifferent to her fight, and Jenna struggled to hold on to the last shreds of hope. When the lawyer gave his closing statement, Jenna's stomach churned. It was a masterful performance, sharp, persuasive, and filled with calculated points that seemed impossible to counter. She wanted to give up. She wanted to walk out of that courtroom and disappear. But just as she prepared herself for the crushing defeat, something shifted within her. A sudden clarity, like a spark of light cutting through the fog. It wasn't over. She wasn't out of options yet. Her heart raced as she realized there was still a chance to expose the truth, to stand tall. Jenna wasn't going down without a fight. She just needed to find a way to win. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Montgomery delivered his ruling, leaving everyone stunned, including the HOA. With an unwavering voice, he declared that the Homeowners Association had not only violated Jenna's rights, but had also grossly abused their power. The lack of clear guidelines and the failure to provide proper notification before tearing down her property were serious missteps. In an unexpected turn, the judge awarded Jenna damages for the destruction of her beloved waterfall and ordered the HOA to rebuild it at their own expense. Jenna's heart raced as the words sank in. The shock of the victory hit her like a wave. After months of frustration, doubt, and tireless fighting, this moment felt surreal. She had won against all odds. The courtroom buzzed as the implications of the decision began to settle in, and Jenna could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a waterfall. It was about standing up to a system that had tried to crush her at every turn. But even as she allowed herself a brief, victorious breath, a feeling of unease lingered. This victory, sweet as it was, wasn't the end. She knew the HOA wasn't going to back down quietly. They were powerful, entrenched in the neighborhood, and their influence stretched far beyond this case. Jenna had no illusions. This battle had been won, but the war wasn't over. She could feel it in the way Eric Murphy's expression tightened as the ruling was read aloud, the shock, the disbelief, the realization that the system he had relied on to control the neighborhood had failed him. The look on his face was the most satisfying part of the entire ordeal. It was a moment of pure justice. His arrogance had crumbled, and now the tables had turned. For Jenna, the victory was sweet, but she knew the next chapter was coming. The HOA would likely push back, and more conflicts were on the horizon. Still, standing there in that moment, Jenna could hold her head high. She had done it. The odds had been stacked against her, and yet justice had prevailed.